I've just been waiting.
Okay, lovely.
Seriously, no one can do that?
I don't care. Let's go here.
There's a little button.
Thank you.
Josh, I go, ooh boy, I hope they tell us to go.
What's going on? Is that some...
My progress is arriving.
Is this working? Amazing. Well, hello everyone. My name is Olivia Posen. I'm a senior and I'm one of your officers of Next Gen Voices, which is the school civic engagement club. And I want to thank you all for being here today for Civics Day. So first, thank you. First of all, I want to apologize for my voice. I have long-term vocal things, so if you can't hear me, just say something and I will repeat whatever I've said. Second, I want to thank you all again for being here today. Our first block is focusing on zoning and transportation and sustainability and public health. So it should be a really interesting panel, and zoning I know might feel like a daunting topic at first, but we luckily have some very exceptional experts here to talk about it and make it much more simple for you all. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. Please just tell us your name, what you do, your involvement with civics, and yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Sure, I will. I'll go. Very official. Hello everyone. Sorry my back is to some of you. Maybe I can reconfigure in a second. My name is Kat Kennett. I use she, her, hers. I'm a planning associate for the city of Newton, so a city planner essentially. I've been there for about 2 years. I mostly work on long-range projects. The biggest project that we've been working on for quite some time is zoning redesign, which some folks here are intimately familiar with, and some maybe not so much, but we'll go into that a bit later. And thanks so much for having us here today. My colleague Nevna will be here shortly as well. She can introduce herself.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me this morning. I'm Allison Bobel-Anna and I'm the Director of Policy for Children's Health Watch. I'll tell you a little bit more about our work in a minute, but I lead all of our federal policy work and work on our policy team that covers local and state policy and health systems transformation. And then I also manage a program out of the Department of Pediatrics at Boston Medical Center, working with families experiencing housing instability and homelessness to receive resources and supports.
Amazing, and Nevna will be here when she comes back. So I think we will start off. I believe Allison is going to begin with a little presentation for us. So if you'd like to take the mic.
Sure. All right, I'm going to stand up just to be a little more mobile. I know that I'm here today to talk about housing, but I would be really remiss if I did not acknowledge the horrific events from yesterday. And I know that this is happening with alarming frequency, and that you all are in a place of a lot of potential vulnerability. And I want to acknowledge all of you here, and I want to thank you for coming to this presentation on Civics Day about what you might be able to do to change the realities in this country and in this community and in this world. And there's a lot of work to do. And so over the next several years, you all will be making a lot of decisions about where you want to head with your life. Maybe you go to college or technical school, choose a major or career. And the piece of unsolicited advice that I will give you today is to say, Howard Thurman once said, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive. Because the world needs people that come alive. And I really hope that all of you choose things that make you come alive in ways that benefit the people and the communities and the nation around us. I'm not going to be the adult that tells you that it's up to your generation to change the world. It is up to all of us. It is a team sport to make a difference, to promote justice in this world. And so that is what I leave for you. And now I will pivot to housing, but I do hope that you all are okay, and that as we emerge from this, we find ways to join together, to comfort, to strengthen, to provide hope and justice in this world. So, as I mentioned, I'm Allison. I'm the Director of Policy for Children's Health. And just to sort of give a little roadmap of where we're going today, we'll give a little framework around how housing and health are connected. I'll tell you a little bit about Children's Health Watch and some of the work we do to connect the dots between research and policy. And then we'll end on some thoughts around what you can do, which I hope will open it up to questions later. So we're going to spend like 30 seconds doing an individual exercise. If you have a pen or paper and you want to write stuff down, that's great. But I want you to think about, what do you think about when you think about the word home? Just a couple minutes or a couple seconds just to think about what's coming to mind when you think about home. So we want to shout out some of the things that are coming to you. What do you think about home? Roof. Who thought about infrastructure? Who thought about buildings? Raise your hand. Who thought about a building? Okay. What else came to mind? Comfort. Comfort. Who thought about a feeling? Comfort, safety. What else is coming to mind?
Homemade food.
Homemade food. Homemade food. Who thought about something that you maybe do at your home? You eat, you sleep, you study. Who thought about some of those things? Great. I think about family. I think about relationships. I think about maybe an address, a physical building, but also sort of my community that I live in. So really, the point of this exercise is I want us to see that home is really a foundation for a lot of things in our lives. But as we know, that foundation has not been very equitably distributed in our country. So who knows what this is a map of? Can everyone see? I'm sorry, people on this side, can you see? Who knows what oh yes.
The Boston area.
The Boston area. And what is this depicting on this map? Has anyone ever seen a map that looks like this? It's all shaded like this? Does anyone know? Oh, up here.
My English teacher, he showed us this map before.
And what is it a map of?
Mr. Nat, would you like to
Oh,
In her defense, it was back in October.
okay, all right.
It's a map of, is it redlining?
This is a redlining map. This is a redlining map, yes. So this is a map from the 30s when the US government, after the Depression, created ways for people to purchase homes by providing loans that were federally backed. Before that, it was very difficult for someone to own a home. Today, most people, their assets, their wealth is in housing. But what did they do in the 30s? The US government, in order to federally back loans, made maps like this, where they shaded areas, green and blue, that were good places for federally backed loans to go. And they shaded places that were red and yellow that were places that were risky for the federal government to back a loan in. So essentially what this did is that it shut out people who were in these red and yellow areas from being able to access home loans, from being able to access generational wealth that people experienced who were able to access home loans. And so what you'll notice about this map, here's Roxbury, here's South Boston, here's Dorchester, here's Newton, here's Brookline, right? And so why does this matter? Of course, 1968, Fair Housing Act, Civil Rights Movement, housing discrimination is done away with. There is a long history of incremental policy that seeks to undo housing discrimination, and yet we continue to see the ripple effects of sort of this structural racism embedded in our policy, in our housing policy, and our zoning policies that continue to ripple today. And so how does that affect housing instability, something that I study? Well, it affects it greatly. So we can take one metric, evictions, when people are forced to move from their homes. This is data from 2021. Roxbury, eviction filing rate 107 per 10,000 renters. Over here is Newton, 37.3. We can still see the disparities. And I work for a health organization, so what I want to know is how does that impact health? Well, again, we continue to see across a number of indicators the impact on health. This right here is a map of infant mortality. There's been a number of studies that have shown that evictions are linked to low birth weight and premature babies, and that is directly linked to infants dying before their first birthday. You can see here's Dorchester, 7.6 rate of infant deaths per 1,000 live births, Newton 2.0. And I could show you these types of maps for a lot of indicators. I could show you rent burden, people paying too much for rent. I could show you homelessness rates. I could show you overcrowding. I could show you poor housing quality. I could show you other health indicators like life expectancy. I could show you diabetes, asthma, you name it. And we're going to see similar overlays to that redlining map. We're going to see areas that were shaded darker and shaded lighter based on where you live. And so we know that structural racism, housing policy, zoning policy are deeply connected to all of these things. And so this is what we do. We draw the links between housing and the foundation for health. And you can think about housing and health sort of in literature, the way we understand it, for sort of 4 pillars. And I'll go through those now. So first, there's stability. When we think about things like homelessness, evictions, forced moves, gentrification, all of these housing indicators that really create instability for families where they're moving frequently or they're being displaced, is really harmful for health. And again, really sort of linked to a long-term sequela of adverse outcomes. We also know that quality, when people think about housing and health, they tend to think about quality. So there are things like mold, pests, exposure to lead, asbestos, crumbling housing infrastructure, safety issues like lack of handrails on stairs and things like that can contribute to a lot of housing quality and safety issues that have a direct impact on health. And then there's affordability. So when we think about affordability, the federal sort of standard, the US standard of what is affordable for someone is 30% of their take-home income towards housing expenses. 30% of their budget, a total family budget, towards housing expenses. And at very alarming rates, we have families spending excesses of 50% of their family budget. That leaves very little for things like food, transportation, utility bills, childcare, everything else in your family budget. So this is where affordability really becomes key. And again, connection to health, we see more healthcare expenditures, people are sicker, people are more likely to go to the emergency room, have other issues related to their health. And then finally, just come to full circle, your neighborhood. And as I mentioned, the sort of impact of zoning, of course, affects all of the factors that I just named. Places where there's a systemic disinvestment in have more poor housing, more housing instability, more lack of affordability, but they also have different sort of neighborhoods surrounding. The aspects of our neighborhoods that really promote health, we think about access to healthy food, outdoor space, green space, reliable transportation, those sorts of things. And we know that all of that sort of surrounds us in our homes, in our housing, in our communities, and impacts health. So, Children's Health Watch, who are we? What do we do? We're a network of pediatricians and public health researchers, and we're really committed to advancing health equity by informing policies that alleviate economic hardships. So we have sites across the country, and what we do is we talk to parents of young children when they're bringing their family in for care, and we try to understand how housing, access to food, childcare, ability to afford medical, and their parents, and what policy solutions are necessary in order to intervene on those conditions. So why do we do this work? Early childhood is a really critical window of brain and body development. We know that 80% of your brain is grown in the first 3 years of life, making it really, really important that families and children are nurtured in their homes, in their communities, have access to food, have access to all the things we know that we need to thrive. We also know that there are incredibly high rates of poverty among infants and toddlers. Families with infants and toddlers are most likely to be housing insecure and live in poverty than any other demographic group in our country. There's systemic inequities that I've talked about significantly here. And that really, prevention requires policy action. We can change the trajectory, we can change it early in life. So what we do is we take research from the front lines of pediatric care, we translate it into policy and systems change action, and then we advocate for solutions. And we do this across a lot of different issues, because as we know, when a family has a housing issue or another issue, it's often linked to a lot of things, other things that are going on. As I mentioned when we talked about housing affordability, everything in a family budget is linked together. And so we look not just at families in silos, but really holistically. And so what we do is we take this research and we really try to get it out through policy, relevant materials, also the press. We advocate and meet with members of Congress and their staff on a regular basis, testify before committees, and then ultimately try to change policies, implement equitable services, and at the end, improve the health of children and families. And so we've done a lot of work on housing and health, and we have seen opportunities of improvement over time. There has been billions of dollars since the start of the pandemic poured in to preventing evictions and to promoting housing stability. And we know that this is work that we can continue. We can actually sort of change the trajectory of families' lives through improving the conditions that surround our housing and our homes. So what can you do? We can get into this hopefully in the conversation as well, is one, educate yourself and others, learn what's going on in your community, in your state, on the federal level around these issues. Connect. This is so important. Connecting with other people who are experiencing the problem. The people who are experiencing the problem are the closest ones to the solutions, and that's where we can learn where change is necessary. And then once we understand those things, once we are partnered with impacted communities and impacted individuals and impacted families, then we can amplify, advocate, and really start to make a difference in this world and our communities. So thank you so much for having me. I will pass it off to my colleagues.
Thank you again to Allison. That was lovely. Can we give one more round of applause? Thank you. And now we're going to switch to Nevna and Kat from the Planning Department to have a presentation for us as well. And then after that, we will move into a Q&A portion. Cool. So thank you. Take us away.
Thanks, Olivia. So first off, hi all. I'm Nevna. I use she, her, hers. I'm the community engagement planner with the city of Newton. So I think it's really great to follow up on Ali's presentation, because we're now going to actually talk about how some of these issues are directly carrying themselves out and impacting the city that your school is in, that maybe you live in, and that you definitely study in, that your teachers work in. So, Kat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Sure. I introduced myself briefly earlier. We weren't here, but no, it's okay. I'm Kat Kemet. I use she, her, hers, and I'm planning associate for the city. I work mostly on long-range projects, so I do some engagement with Nevna. I do some policy work. You might have seen me do some presentations of public hearings if you've ever gone to those. No reason why you need to have done that, but yeah.
So we also both work for the Department of Planning and Development. And how many of you have heard about urban planning? Oh wow, a lot of you. Okay, I had no idea what it was. No one brought it up when I was in high school, and I didn't know about it actually until after college. There is a joke that urban planning is just pointing. You often see people like pointing at maps and pointing at locations. There is a Tumblr page with all of these photos. But urban planning is actually an incredibly dynamic field, right? It involves like economic processes, it involves community members and how they're engaging with each other, it involves interactions with your elected officials. I mean, even just this image itself, which is of Diversity Plaza in Queens, we see all of these factors at play. And actually, whenever you're walking down a street, you can see all of these elements carrying themselves out. But urban planning also uses tools in order to try to address the infrastructure and the way that we're living in our spaces. So this also includes mapping. This is actually our zoning map that Kat will go over. It includes design, right? How do we build new buildings? And then it also includes community engagement. And the bottom right image is actually me working with community members on how to improve the parks around their school. And then includes thinking about infrastructure, right? Where do we get our water from? How do we deal with land? How do we deal with housing and transportation? And then of course, just like Ali was highlighting, the way that our built space is formed is directly impacted by how we see each other socially, by the power dynamics, by who ultimately comes into power, and also what are the ways in which we value different lives. And I also will say that while we use the term urban planning, right, that word urban is there. So we often think that these are cities, these are where we have, a lot of roads and highways. But it's also thinking about where we get our resources from. So I think a lot of us here know that we don't get our gas from Newton, right? We don't have drilling sites here, we don't have fracking sites. We also can get our electricity or the minerals for our phones, the minerals for our laptops from all over the place. So I think when we also think of urban planning, I encourage all of us to also think about the sites in which we extract these resources.
You want to give me the power? Okay, so what is zoning? The question everyone is always asking. I talk about zoning all the time, and my friends have had to implement a no talking about zoning at the party rule. So that could be in your future. So zoning is essentially a set of laws. So it regulates how land can be used in the city, and it has a really strong impact on the shape that buildings take and where certain uses and types of buildings are allowed. In Newton and in many places, common uses are residential, retail, commercial, agriculture, public space, things like that. They're often really simple categories, but that category determines a whole lot. So in Newton and also in many towns, the zoning ordinance is the text and the tables that explain those rules, and there's also a map that you could use to determine what rules are going to apply to that land. So every single parcel in Newton is zoned something, and you can look it up on the assessor's database, which I use all the time. It has a lot of really great information, like what your neighbor's house is assessed at, like what the zoning is, how big the lot is. So it has a lot of really useful municipal information, but it also tells us a lot about what is possible on that lot. I like to think of zoning as sort of a blueprint for what's possible. It's not visible in the landscape, but it sets the rules of the game for what's possible. So zoning determines a lot of things, including really at the most basic level, the size and shape of buildings that are allowed. So zoning essentially has really huge leeway. So it varies a lot by town. So if you know every single thing about the zoning in Newton, which I don't, it doesn't really tell you anything about what zoning is in Cambridge or Boston. It's like you have to kind of relearn everything from scratch because there are very specific dimensional controls, like a building can only be so many feet high, it can only take up so much of a lot. It's really quite basic in that way. And it has a really strong impact in how a neighborhood can look and feel. So when we're thinking about changing zoning and thinking about what we want or what is going to be possible, it could take all these different types of shapes, or maybe a certain set of rules can allow all these different types of shapes, or none of them. It just allows for a future possibility there. So this is my beautiful diagram that I've put together. I'm no graphic designer, but an important thing to know when it comes to zoning in Newton is that there are a couple of different pathways, but by and large, these are the two to keep in mind. Zoning done by right is basically what is in the zoning ordinance point blank. So whatever is in there for SR1, if you live in an SR1 zone, you can look up the rules that apply to that. If you want to build something in an SR1 zone, if you follow those rules, as long as you follow them, you can do it. So you have to check off the boxes that you're following those rules, and as long as you do it legally, there's nothing the city should be able to do to stop you from doing that. It's a pretty simple process that goes through our inspectional services department, so they'll make sure that you checked all those boxes, and as long as you did, you can get a building permit and you can build a house, or you can, you know, convert the use of a veterinary use to a bigger veterinary use, things like that. So by right zoning is how most projects go through. It is faster, it is pretty predictable, and you know, we have projects that go through by right every day in City Hall. But there are other projects that are only allowed by special permit, so this is a more intense process. Bigger projects like Riverside, Trio, those bigger housing or multi-use projects that you might have heard of lately, most of those go through only by special permit. So that is a more involved process. It takes a lot longer, it's often more expensive, and it goes through review by the city. It goes through review by the Land Use Committee, which is a subsection of City Council. It requires a public hearing, at least one, often, you know, could be 4 or 5 or more for bigger projects, and it's more expensive and it takes a long time. So this is, at this point you've seen a lot of maps of Newton. This is our zoning map. And where things are allowed to be built, as we've heard earlier today, is so crucial to what is allowed to be built in those places and shapes what they look like. So zoning influences sustainability in a really impactful way. Zoning can include tons of rules about sustainability, or it can include none at all. So it can set rules for stormwater management. It can set rules for whether you are required to use green technology or not in building construction. It really can go to a lot of places with that. Obviously it impacts housing. I don't think I could say any of that better than Allison already has. It impacts economic development. If you don't allow retail as a use, you can't have retail. So it has a really fundamental and strong connection to the, you know, whether you can have a mall or whether you can have a corner store, zoning determines that. Transportation, zoning controls what parking is required. So in Newton, if you are adding a new unit of housing, 2 parking spaces are required no matter what. I don't have a car. If I was to build a house in Newton, which I could never afford to do, I would still have to add 2 parking spots. And there's not really any leeway for that unless you want to go through a pretty intense process. And even then, sometimes it's still not allowed. And it also can require or not require bike parking. And in terms of vibrancy, you know, having public plazas, allowing for coffee shops, things like that. These are all, zoning touches everything. It's completely inescapable, essentially. So hopefully we've made that case. Zoning redesign is an effort that the city has undertaken to really do a pretty significant revamp of our zoning code. Newton has had zoning in place, I should know this, I think it's since like 1918 or 1916, something like that. And though, you know, most parts of the zoning ordinance have been updated in some way since then, a lot of them haven't been updated since like 1930, 1950 at all. And I think we all know that the needs of people who live in Newton and the problems that we face, in, like climate change, the housing crunch in the area, the needs and the problems have changed quite a lot. And so the city has a comprehensive plan, we have a climate action plan, we have a housing plan that have all been adopted, you know, within the past 10 years, and, or a little more, and zoning is not supporting those goals. And it's really serving as a barrier to us accomplishing some of those goals. So by making some pretty significant changes, we hope that we can have more tools and be better able to, you know, address these needs and move us in a direction that people are wanting to see. So that was a lot. I know we're in a school, but I'm not going to test you on it. I wouldn't even know where to start. But we have a lot of resources available. We have a zoning booklet that we put together in partnership with some fabulous young people in this room here. We have tons of maps, we have lots of information on our website, and if you ever have any questions, you can always email us, but want to make sure that that's available to you.
All right, so I'm gonna try to go through this quickly so we can get to Q&A, but everything that Kat said, we are in a phase of community engagement and policy deliberation right now. And while we want to focus on all of the districts in Newton, we're currently focusing on the village centers. And I know that if not all of you, many of you go to Newtonville like every day, and that's an example of a village center, right? Where we have our businesses and our retail, as well as a lot of transit stops. And so last summer, we did our first phase of engagement and also just an analysis, right? Understanding what is actually built there, what are the stores, how many of those stores are also empty. I think probably some of you have seen a lot of vacant storefronts, and that often is actually because of cost, right? People can't keep renting there, and the landlords might not be able to afford to lower the rent. So doing all these analyses of these 13 village centers in Newton. And then we also did an engagement phase. I recognize actually multiple of you here who contributed to that, just asking what's your vision for your village center? What are the values you want to see guiding that process? So we did a lot of different kinds of engagement. So actually a sustainability class in the lower right corner here that we met with. We also engaged with renters from the Newton Housing Authority, and many more. And then we went to I don't know who here has gone to Festa in Onantum. Okay, if you haven't gone, it's really fabulous. I strongly recommend it. But we were there and we just did a lot of different kinds of events. And we engaged about 2,000 people in Newton. And by the way, when I also say who we're engaging, I list that as residents, people who live here, renters or homeowners, people who study here, and people who work here. So a lot of times you can hear community engagement just focus on people who have the right to vote, but I think we all understand that the places we live are actually comprised of many more than that, and we should hear from all of them. So the main takeaways we heard from everyone is wanting more climate resiliency through built structures. The number one thing we heard actually was wanting more communal and public space and more activation of that. The majority of land, though, that we have in Newton and in a lot of places is privately owned. And actually, zoning is mostly focused also on private development. And so this is an interesting thing, right? How do we have more communal space and public space when a lot of our development is actually private? And that's where zoning can really come in. People said they want more diverse housing options and encourage mixed-use projects. Newton, for example, does not allow multifamily housing by right at all. Kat just walked us through the special permit versus the by right process. In order to build something that's 3 units or more, it is significantly harder. And so we don't have many special permit processes for those housing options. People also wanted to increase the ability for small businesses to begin, stay, and thrive. So that goes back to the vacant storefronts, increasing accessibility, both for physical accessibility and also for people with children, people who are older, and then also increasing ease to get around and making the permitting process easier. I think also what's probably most relevant for you all is that not many younger people are really sought out for their opinions and to actually be heard from in Newton. There also is a pretty big disparity between renters that we hear from. We most often hear from homeowners in Newton, and of course those are not the only people that we should be hearing from. And so through our work, and actually especially organizing with Next Gen and with the Youth Commission, we were able to have a significantly more amount of people from the ages of 15 to 24. The column on the left is of a survey we did in 2020, and the column on the right is who we heard from in 2021. And as you can see, we also really were able to adjust the amount of homeowners we heard from and increase the amount of renters, although of course, we are still far below the demographic of renters and the proportion of people we should be hearing from. So now we're entering the second phase of village centers. So based on what we heard from everyone last summer, we're now getting into the actual technical proposals. And so Kat is now gonna say a little bit about what we're considering for those zoning changes.
Sure, this is a sort of overwhelming sort of matrix here that we have concocted to talk about these proposals. I won't go into too much detail here, and a lot of this is still kind of cooking, but we had, it was a interesting and sort of difficult process to take these sort of, I don't want to say pie in the sky, but sort of inexact takeaways, like we want more public space. And how do we translate that sentiment into really technical law with the constraints that we have in play, and considering that we don't just have limitless land that we can zone public use or anything like that. So we have this, we have a sort of list of our tools that we have here, and some of those takeaways that, that we heard in that process, and we use those takeaways to really guide that technical work. So using the takeaways, but also doing an assessment of, like, you know, what, a lot of experimentation essentially in looking at the rules we have on the ground now. Could we build multifamily housing? Like, would it pencil out financially? Looking at just what is allowed and how can we tweak the rules and change them to better facilitate what we heard in those takeaways. So we're at the point now where we do have a proposal for these village centers that is pretty technical, and our work now is to make sure that members of the public can understand this really technical proposal that we have here and understand the implications. So you don't need to understand that the FAR is 0.5. Like, I don't even fully understand that, but what that means is you can build a little bit bigger and you will be able to get a little bit more. So we're in the process now of sort of synthesizing these technical things and translating them into something that we can, a tool that we can use to do another round of engagement. This is the last switch. Okay, so now we're going into the next phase of engagement. I think something we might not have mentioned is that the body who ultimately makes the decisions on any zoning changes is called the Zoning and Planning Committee. I'm guessing most of you already know this, but Newton has 24 city councilors. So you can compare that to a city like LA that has in the teens city councilors. So there's a lot of people we have to hear from. The Zoning and Planning Committee consists of 8 councilors who ultimately make the decision. And so we're going to do community engagement in the late summer and the early fall in order to get kind of a community temperature check on this. And I know that Next Gen and also the Youth Commission are going to be really involved, and I really hope that we can hear from more of you too. If you want to be more involved with that, you can definitely let us know. And I think that's everything from us, so thank you.
All right, thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, there we go. All right, thank you so much to Neville and Kat. One more round of applause for them as well. And now we're going to move into a Q&A portion. So if you're here via the live stream, can you please bring that up? Max, do you mind holding that up? We'll have a QR code, and there should also be a QR code at a whole bunch of your feeds. So if you want to submit anything via the QR code because the microphone is feeling a little intimidating, this is a way that you can do it. Also, if you have, we have a bunch of questions, so we can start off with us and then we'll come to the audience for a bunch of questions as well. So I'll have my lovely moderators introduce themselves who are here with me from my club, from our club. So I'll pass it to you.
Hi, I'm Olivia, and I'm a senior.
Hi, I'm Max, and I'm also a senior. All right.
Hi, I'm Pamela.
And I'm a junior.
This is a question for Gavina and Kat. You guys kind of went over about how zoning changes could redesign communities, how they shape them. What is like a specific example of how zoning impacts the daily life of the average Newtonian? Like I'm just walking around, how does zoning really impact what I see, what I'm experiencing?
Specifically, can I add on, how would zoning impact the life of like an average young Newtonian, seeing as you're speaking to a whole bunch of high schoolers?
Yeah.
You're welcome to.
Okay. I think the number one thing that comes to my mind is retail. What kind of stores you're able to go into. I remember actually hearing a great, during last summer's engagement, hearing from high schoolers actually from Newton North on what they wanted to see in the village centers, and a couple people brought up thrift shops. So somewhere that they could actually buy some stuff for, less money than some of the boutiques that currently exist in Newton. Places also that are just free to be in. I remember some younger people bringing up, you can't eat in the library, for example. So where can you eat and study, which is something I deeply relate to. So I think the retail is really impacted by the cost of being able to rent, which is impacted by the cost that the landlord purchased the building for and also needs to rent that space for. And that also is often influenced by the size of the building, and also by the process by which the building needed to be developed. And so the size, when we get into that dimensions, it seems so sterile, and it seems kind of like, there's not many values built into that, but those dimensions actually directly impact the cost of the building, also can impact what kind of, utilities are being used, or just the general infrastructure. I'd also say in addition is density. So I think to what extent people are even living in the village center, for example, right? I think a lot of us really enjoy being in vibrant spaces that also have a lot of different ages. Something that I've heard, again, tying this back to the cost of housing and the type of housing available, which is impacted by zoning, whether you can return and live in Newton. And we heard from a lot of younger people in our engagement last summer is that they don't feel like they can actually come back to Newton because it is too expensive. And we are seeing even an impact on the population, for example, in schools. There are less children enrolled in Newton schools. Obviously, we can't find a really direct correlation between that and zoning, but we do know that the amount of housing we have available in a city does impact the amount of younger families living here, and thus the amount of children in a school, which then impacts the amount of funding that your school is getting from the state. So I think those are a couple of the things, but I don't know if you want to add. Thank you.
Okay, here's a question from the QR code for Allison, who had mentioned that pediatricians use data from patients for studies. Do the patients know that their answers are being used for studies, and how do you keep data collection ethical?
Yeah, so the people who are participating in our studies go through an informed consent process. So before we even collect any information on them, we go through kind of an extensive process where we let them know what the study is about, let them know that they can skip any questions, stop participating at any point, that it's all confidential, and the way in which we store the data. So before you even start the research, we ask permission of the parent. And then every research study in an academic institution has to go through a process called Institutional Review Board approval. So there's a whole research ethics body that's actually governed by federal law that sort of dictates how studies remain ethical. So we could have a whole session on just research ethics, but that's sort of a summary of how we keep it ethical.
My question is, when and why did you begin to take an interest in zoning and housing?
Housing, I've been interested in for a long time. I think I'm from this area generally, and housing costs has impacted me and my friends quite a lot, so it's like personal, but it's also professionally, I'm interested in trying to make processes more equitable and just like big picture, like help people live. And you know, housing is where that starts, and I think in so many ways. Zoning was a more torturous and twisted path. I have been trying to get away from working in zoning, but it just keeps happening because it is like, I get really worked up. In grad school, I worked on a project with the Greater Boston Community Land Trust, a really fantastic group of folks that's trying to help make CLTs happen, which is a pretty innovative and to be really exciting framework to think about land and home ownership and what that can look like and alternative models of that. And they were asking us to look at ways in which zoning can be used to make that more equitable and you know, improve that process. And basically the answer is it can't. Like, you know, there are little things you can do. You can like try to upzone, you can try to tweak this, tweak that, but like fundamentally, like zoning is not meant to do that, or like that's just not how it works, at least on the ground in Boston now. So I found myself really frustrated about that, and like, you know, I guess it's sort of keep your enemy close. Zoning in many ways like really frustrates me. It can be used for good things, but it's often really not. So it's been really cool to learn about that and work on zoning issues in Newton, which is like just such a privileged community, and the forces and the politics in Newton is so different from Boston. When we were talking about zoning changes in Boston, it's like completely different from how it's talked about in Newton. So it's been really eye-opening, and I think making me a more well-rounded adversary of exclusionary zoning.
Yeah, I think similarly with housing, I currently, as a renter, this is the highest rent cost that Boston has ever had. And you know, to be frank, it kind of feels like how much longer can I live in the Boston area? So I think there's that. I think also like my own family and also friends of mine who are just directly impacted by where they can live. I mean, it impacts all other parts of your life. In terms of zoning, I actually first heard of zoning because of gentrification. I don't know how many people here have heard that term, gentrification, but it basically means particularly communities of color and working class and low income communities getting pushed out, right? Because prices were increased, and that is often associated with white people and white wealthy people moving in. And that even impacts the way police presence is in the space. So I think gentrification is connected with zoning because zoning is about upzoning, in other words, increasing the density in space. And so in New York City, majority communities of color were upzoned in order to allow more market rate apartments to be built. And so that's where I first learned about zoning and felt like it was evil. I guess still feel that way in a lot of maybe you can't say that as a city employee. But I think that Newton is such a weird place because it's the opposite of that. It actually doesn't allow almost any density in the city. And so there's really like, it's just a bizarre opposite world. And I think that's what makes me really interested in zoning in Newton.
So trying to think back to my sort of initial interest in housing, I think I grew up in the South in a predominantly white suburb, and so sort of housing and housing stability and zoning were not really on my radar until I went to college. And I remember sort of this moment when I was volunteering when I was in college to tutor students in nearby where I went to school in Birmingham. And one of the students I was tutoring was a middle school girl whose home was razed. The building she was living in was torn down in a gentrifying neighborhood in the city of Birmingham in order to build mixed income housing. But when they rebuilt the housing, they didn't build as many affordable units in the housing that had existed previously. And so I watched this young girl, her life kind of unravel and her family kind of unravel from this sort of experience of displacement and sort of being priced out of the community and other things. And at the time, I thought I wanted to go into like direct service type work. I was really interested in issues related to poverty and thought I might work at some sort of direct service. And then I started realizing that actually the places that needed to be changed were the policy level and the structure and systems level, that I could tutor the student all day long, and that was really important and meaningful to both of us. But at the end of the day, like what's going to change the reality was changing the policy that enabled her home to be sort of torn down without her family's say and to be displaced. And so I think there's sort of been these moments in my sort of life and career where I've sort of seen these moments of really systemic injustice and sort of been sort of driven to try to understand how do I partner and participate in ways that seek to mitigate that.
Thank you. A lot of people have interest in the concept of redlining. Can one or multiple of you explain the connection that zoning has to redlining?
I guess I'm gonna have, this is not a hot take, but I start every conversation that way. This is not a hot take. I think redlining is absolutely relevant to zoning, but I almost wish sometimes we could separate those conversations more, because I think it's really easy to think of redlining as something in the past, which is like it's literally not legal now, but zoning is a really different way of looking at land and housing. They're really quite separate systems that just have to sort of, they interact, but like they operate sort of on different playing fields. So I think we should absolutely be informed by redlining and the forces there, and like that have ripple effects not only for zoning, but for education, for everything. But what we're dealing with when we're thinking about exclusionary zoning and those impacts now is really quite different. And like the rules of the game are really different. So I think, you know, in many ways, Newton is like a really interesting and frustrating place to work, because redlining has already done its work. Like redlining has already pushed out a lot of the people of color, and not just redlining, also the highway system going through. When they planned the highway going through Newton, they did it right through the historic Black neighborhood, and many of those families never moved back. So I think it's really important to like understand and really think about redlining, but also try to like learn and understand why is it, we know that impact happened and is still happening, but like what are we doing now to change those dynamics and to try to change the rules of the game? Because zoning was put in place around the same time as redlining, and we have reckoned-ish, or at least we have acknowledged the impact that redlining has had, but not so much local zoning rules. I think when we think about like gentrification and those forces, it's really easy, this is not calling you out, at all. Like, it's easy to point to New York and say, it's so clear that it's happening there. It's so clear that in Dorchester, these forces are at work. Like, it's really quite visible, but in Newton, it's pretty invisible, and it's really easy to brush under the rug and say, redlining was so terrible. So glad we don't have that anymore. But like, we still have all of the other trappings that came with it. It's not possible to build multifamily housing by right. That's huge. That's really significant. And like other towns around here are looking at Newton and saying, why aren't you doing your part? We didn't even really get into this, but there's a state level bill that has been in the news a lot lately that basically is requiring towns that don't allow multifamily housing by right, that are served by the T, to change those rules and to allow it by right. It's been so controversial. I really highly recommend you take a look at what your city councilors are saying about that. And you know, if this is something that you're interested in, this is something that's like really happening right now and has the power to try to subvert some of those dynamics. I'm not even talking about redlining anymore, I'm sorry. But like when we're talking about like that, this is not an endorsement of that policy, but at the very least, I think we should look at this as an opportunity to say, like, you know, would multifamily housing, changing those rules, would that serve to undo some of the damage that was done by redlining? Maybe, I don't know, but I think that is something that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think absolutely agree. I don't want to conflate the two. If you're ever interested in a great summer read, I would highly recommend, if you want to dive into this more, I'd highly recommend the book, The Color of Law. And really what the author does is sort of divide the policies surrounding housing into two sort of groups, right? There's de jure, so there's laws that were written into federal, state, local policy, right? So redlining is an example of that. It was part of federal law and practice. And then there's de facto, and those are things that are not necessarily written into the law, but the impact of policies like zoning, like not allowing multifamily homes, like the construction of a highway, that de facto have the effect of creating segregation, of structural racism. And so when we think about sort of zoning and redlining, I do agree we can separate them, but we can also think about the ways in which, even when not written into law, there are policies that are having the de facto effect of keeping certain people out of communities. So that's always a helpful thing when I'm thinking about policies, and I apply this to a lot of policies, to sort of start to look for the civil rights movement did away with a lot of explicit forms of discrimination and outlined a lot of explicit forms of discrimination. But when you start to sort of pull back the rug on what are some of across policies, what are some of the effects of different policies that are having, they are really continuing that sort of legacy of adverse impact.
All right, I have one more quick question for you. Two questions into one. What is currently being done to break the chain between poor housing and health? And would it be more effective to improve housing or to create new health care in order to improve public health?
Great. Okay.
So first, the question, so there's actually a lot of work being done to sort of understand how can health and housing and social services and zoning and all of these sort of sectors connect in order to solve housing as a health issue. So I'll give an extreme example. You may have seen in the news over the past many months, Mass and Cass, which is right outside of Boston Medical Center where I work and my spouse works. There's a massive, there were massive encampments of people experiencing homelessness who were also experiencing various medical issues. And so what Boston Medical Center and the city have done is really partnered to provide housing and medical services, addiction treatment, mental health services for people on site. And there's a lot of sort of work being done across the country of health systems and housing systems sort of partnering together to provide housing and the services that we know that people need in order to be supported long-term in their homes. To the second part of your question, I do want to note that healthcare and public health are two different things. So, when you go to the hospital, you're receiving health care, but really where public health happens is everywhere, right? It is the thing, it is all the things in our world that are shaping our health, which for the most part exists outside of medical interventions. Sure, vaccines and checkups and all of that is really important for public health, but as is clean water, stable housing, nutritious food, all of the things that sort of exist outside of that. And so I actually think we need both. We need access to affordable health care when we get sick and we need health care, but we really also, if we want to improve health, we actually want to make the health of our populations better, then we have to sort of think about what we call social determinants of health, so all of the other forces that are sort of shaping our ability to be healthy.
All right, and I will ask one more question because I know our time is almost coming to a close. So I guess this is for all of you. I know Devin and Kat have an answer for this, but for all of the young people out here, what is a way that you can get involved if this is something that you've listened today and you think this is something you'd be interested in and you're passionate about? What is a way that you can get involved? I know Hannah and Max and I are working on something, so if you want to touch on that too.
Yeah, I mean, the immediate thing is getting involved with our current phase of engagement on zoning redesign. We actually just kicked off a thing called the Community Engagement Network. And basically, this is a group of community members who are helping us staff co-design the engagement effort. I also think something about urban planning is that when we start getting into the actual technical elements, there is a knee-jerk reaction of city staff and I think elected officials to just leave it to the quote-unquote experts, right? These are people who are really technically and professionally oriented around this work, but I actually think we are all responsible for understanding the more, you could say complicated or technical ways in which our world is constructed. So this engagement network is basically both training people on what zoning is, what these technical things are, as well as what are the ways in which we can organize our community spaces. Because I think that's also another part of both public health and our built spaces, the way in which we organize each other. And what I mean by that is identifying the issues that we share with each other and how do we build power through that. I kind of consider myself organizing around the concept of democracy, around how to make sure that we are all included in the conversation and for the elected officials to consider. So the Community Engagement Network, the meetings are open, they're all virtual, and we will be building up that engagement work for the late summer and the fall. And then we'll actually have an installation at the Newton Free Library. So I think both for the students and for the teachers in here, you all can do a field trip to the library, and the room is going to be set up actually as an engagement room, so that you can not just look at the elements of zoning, the ways also in which zoning impacts things and doesn't impact things. I think what Kat was raising, affordability, can actually be addressed in a lot of non-zoning ways, and for you all to have those discussions and then submit your input for the City Council to consider.
Sure, and so I guess from the Children's Health Watch perspective, feel free to sign up for our newsletter and we can provide you update information, and we always have sort of calls to action if you're really someone who enjoys writing, you're a member of Congress, and if you're not, I hope that you become one someday. And then we also have internships, so if you're interested in a potential internship in the future, feel free to reach out to me and we can potentially consider that as well.
All right, so thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our panelists and my lovely moderators. And if this was exciting, we will have a D-Block panel on Main Street where you'll be able to interact with a whole bunch of different booths related to different civics organizations, as well as E and F Block panels. So we hope to see you back here later. Thank you again for coming.
I just went home and watched out for a second.